Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Shanker Chronicles podcast. This 6-episode podcast series is an opportunity for me to take a deep dive into the historical, political, scientific, and philosophical background to some of the big issues of our day. So thank you for joining me again as we all work towards a more regulated society, a self-reg society, and a just society. In my last podcast, I talked about shame, and today I want to talk about the opposite. I want to talk about shamelessness. We are witnessing a remarkable growth of shamelessness, and it is coming from the top. It's a top-down phenomenon. It seems to be driven by not just our political leaders, but also by business leaders, really any kind of prominent figure, but especially by political leaders. And we're seeing this not just in the US, but we're seeing it around the world. And it's not just, a sort of casual disregard for old conventions. In fact, shamelessness is becoming something like a badge of honor. It is done brazenly, openly, and it seems to operate as a sort of confirmation of your own specialness. Now, that, of course, is one of the classic ways in which we look at narcissism. And so we could say, well, what we're witnessing today is this remarkable surge of narcissistic leaders. And I think there's an element of truth in that. And there's been some important work shedding light on the nature of narcissism, on the narcissistic ego, and the effect that this has on others. But I actually think there's something else involved here, something a little bit more well, if you like, serious. And that's where Self-Reg comes in. So what I want to do today is look at, in a way, the manner in which shamelessness is being weaponized. One of the very first things I read about this, which got me thinking about the topic, was some time ago. Michelle Dean in The Guardian wrote an article called A Mentor in Shamelessness. And it's really an article about how Roy Cohn shaped Donald Trump, cultivated in Trump the same shamelessness which Cohn was remarkably well known for. But this wasn't the point that she's making in this article, is that Trump wasn't just learning that he could get away with shamelessness. He was learning how he could exploit shamelessness. Now, in a very simple sense, I was thinking, if you're a narcissist and you desperately crave public attention, then shameless behavior is one of the most effective ways you can do this. The fact is that the general public is drawn to stories about shameless behavior in the way that, say, moths are drawn to the light. So the more shameless your behavior, the more attention you'll receive. And, it's attention, good or bad, it's attention. But there's something else that's going on here other than how shamelessness is a sort of self-rewarding behavior. We have to remember that as far back as 1987, Trump was publicly, floating his interest in running for the presidency. And in fact, he did. He ran for it in 1999 as a Reform Party candidate. This is a long-term ambition. What was so unusual about 2015 was the way he capitalized on shameless behavior. Um, what he had learned was really the behavior that sent him into the White House. Um, Now, when I talked about, that may be a little bit paradoxical, given what I was talking about in my last podcast, how shame is absolutely vital for maintaining group cohesion. We have lots of different kinds of works, philosophical, sociological, on the role of shame in a in what Margaret Mead called a shame society, how it holds the society together. The function, which I discussed last podcast, is really to enforce group conformity to shared norms of right and wrong. You'd think that shameless behavior would um, would be self-defeating. Yet here we have a case where, if you look at England, you can look at far right in France, you can look at the US, where um, political figures are deliberately um, demonstrating as shameless behavior as they can, with no sense of, second thoughts. So we need to figure this one out. Why are they doing this, and what is the effect? What's the impact? And what I'm going to suggest today is that where shame is used to maintain a group's morality, their sense of right and wrong, shamelessness is used to change a group's morality, to change their sense of right or wrong, and in effect, to reframe shame, uh, to convert shame, what was hitherto shameful behavior, into its opposite. And they're doing this in a manner that, as the more I've thought about this, the more it strikes me that this is very Nietzschean. That what we are witnessing today is something that Nietzsche spelled out when he distinguished between what he called a master morality and a slave morality. So that's really what this is about today. In Nietzsche's mind, um, a master morality really values, above everything else, it values power. Whereas slave morality, what he calls a slave morality, values empathy, kindness, compassion. And for a master morality, what is good is defined as anything that serves my needs. What is bad is anything that blocks my needs. So the idea here is then that there will be certain individuals um, uh, in a master morality society that deserve to be our leader. They are naturally more powerful. They are naturally more imposing. In a slave society, everybody's equal. In a slave society, you believe in, let's say, universal rights. For Nietzsche, the origins of slave morality was Judeo-Christianity. This preaching of justice tempered by compassion, and that, first of all, that's the reason why they placed so much emphasis. Why Judeo-Christianity places so much emphasis on shame. They are for um, Nietzsche a shame society in Mead's terms, whereas master morality is a shameless society where only power rules. And the reason why Judeo-Christianity placed so much emphasis on shame was in order to control those who would naturally be masters, those who, those who are by their nature, by their genetics, uh, as as Trump on more than one occasion speculated, their genetics predestined them to be these superhuman like figures. And you think of those murals. I can't remember what they're called now, but the art that's been done depicting Donald Trump as some sort of god or some sort of superhuman, and all of that is part of the master morality mentality. So if you think about it, what he's really saying in Beyond Good and Evil, in Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, is this is an attack on the Enlightenment. If you like, I could get Adam to add to our bibliography. There's been some very good books written on how the Enlightenment was inspired by a 17th century rereading of the Old Testament, an attempt to revive the Old Testament view of a just society. And so what Nietzsche was really doing was he's attacking the Enlightenment. And what he's saying is that the Enlightenment is enforcing, using shame to turn us all into slaves. In particular, turning the Donald Trumps of society into a slave. It's seeking to use shame to control their nature, which is to be this powerful leader who actually does stand above the law. And hence the fights that we see, for example, in the US about the powers of the presidency. The point I'm making here is that this is not simply a case of narcissism. This is a sort of Nietzschean scenario in which the laws that apply to slaves, those with a slave mentality, do not apply to the master leaders. The part that I'm interested in today is a little bit more historical than usual, and that is, how this took root in U.S. society, or say, as we see today in England. And I am convinced that it goes beyond, far back. This is not just something that happened in 2015, 2016. And the roots actually go back to the Cold War. And the reason is that the U.S. found itself right after the war. I mean, it was already obvious in 43 and 44, and this is what Winston Churchill was fighting against. He could foresee the problems that they were going to have with Stalin, with the Soviet Union. And so this is the reason why Churchill worked so hard to ensure that Russia would not interfere in Greece, that Greece would remain a democracy. And Churchill was prepared to concede to Stalin Balkan countries, thinking that at least he could protect Greece. So let him take Romania, let him take Georgia or Ukraine, but we can protect Greece. But it became very clear right after the Yalta Conference that Stalin had no intention of sticking to whatever commitments he had made to Roosevelt and Churchill. He was utterly shameless and intent. He believed that he had historical determinism behind him, that the world, that capitalism had reached its zenith, that the course of history was such that all of Europe would go communist, and he would do whatever was necessary in order to facilitate that. And so the Allies found themselves in a very precarious position. And their response right after the war, and this would be inspired not just by Churchill, but most importantly by George Kennan. George Kennan was the ambassador to Russia, and he wrote a report about Russia, 1946, the letter from Russia, and then an article that he published in Foreign Affairs in 1947, in which he laid out the terms on which the Allies must fight the menace that Stalin or Stalinist Russia posed. And what he said, and I'll just read this, this is a wonderful quote. He said, to avoid its own moral destruction, the United States must measure up to its own best traditions and prove itself worthy of preservation as a great nation. So what he was saying in his long telegram and in his Foreign Affairs article was that this battle, this extraordinary post-war battle, was between the Enlightenment and the Counter-Enlightenment, and that the U.S. must not, it must not descend into the same tactics as the Soviet Union was using. The Soviet Union under Stalin would do whatever was required: subversion, terrorism, you name it, they'll do it to bring down a democratic government. The most obvious example of this is what the Soviets did in Poland, where Churchill fought valiantly to preserve democracy in Poland and kept on making concession after concession in the hopes that he could still ensure that there would be free and open elections in Poland. Thought that he had gotten Stalin's agreement to this, but Stalin never intended to have free and open elections in Poland. Imposed his own communist followers. And so what happened in Poland was this incredibly sharp lesson for the Allies, that they were up against an enemy that was not going to play by the same rules, that it was irrelevant what commitments they had made. And so in the meantime, they had seeded spies throughout the West, especially in England and the US, and were intent all along at just placating Churchill and Roosevelt in order to get their way, in order to plant the seeds for world revolution. And so the Kennan doctrine, Kennan's writings in 46 and 47 inspired what became known as the Truman Doctrine, the doctrine of containment, containing the Soviet Union. And this was, there are many aspects of why this was so important. The most obvious one would be the Marshall Plan, where they were intent on, restructuring Europe that had been destroyed, especially Germany. They would not repeat the errors that they'd made in the First World War of, further punishing the defeated nation. Instead, they would help to revive certain aspects of the German economy, mindful of the dangers of reviving anything that could contribute to rearmament. And so they began to fight, the Allies and Russia, Soviet Union began fighting over the fate of Germany, and it ultimately leads to the division of Germany, with France, England, and America getting their own sectors in Western Germany, the Soviet Union getting its sector in Eastern Germany. And then the most bizarre thing of all, of course, was the splitting deep within this Eastern German territory, splitting Berlin into the Western sector and the Eastern sector, which eventually led in 1961 to the creation of the Berlin Wall. As they became aware, and they couldn't deny this, so as they became aware of what Stalin was doing, American policy began to change. And one of the so-called six wise men, who had initially stood with Kennan, now began to break away. So the new Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, in 1949, developed a new policy, basically fighting fire with fire. So he had the National Security Council create the CIA. And I'll read you another quote from that time. The CIA would use, quote, propaganda, economic warfare, preventive direction action, including sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition and evacuation measures, subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance movements, guerrillas and refugee liberation groups, and support of indigenous anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world. In other words, where there was a country, take your pick, Nicaragua. Well, the worst example of this was what the CIA did in Chile. I am a great fan of the writings of Isabel Allende, who was the goddaughter and cousin of Salvador Allende, and has written several books about her experience as the CIA backed Pinochet revolution, which was just a horror, a terror for Chileans. As Allende's government, which was a leftist government, was overturned and Allende himself was killed, murdered. So the important point when we think about the CIA's activities, and this goes right back to Eisenhower. So Eisenhower sanctioned CIA's subversive activities in countries where they sought to prevent a communist takeover, and it reaches, its sort of greatest disaster with Kennedy's Bay of Pigs in '61, where they tried to use Cuban expats to overturn Castro's government, and tried many times to assassinate, without success, to assassinate Castro. And, to this day, the CIA has still kept secret its involvement in Chile in '73. All of these subversive actions, all of the terrible things they were doing, the waterboarding in Guantanamo, these were to be kept secret from the American public. And there was a report that was written in 1954, and it was a secret report that has now been made public, called the Doolittle Report. And there was this one line in the Doolittle Report that sums up everything that was going on in the U.S., in U.S. government in the 50s and 60s. And it says, quote, "We are facing an implacable enemy, namely the Soviet Union, whose overall objective is world domination. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply to fighting the Cold War." So what they're saying here is that Stalin is, the epitome of a master morality, as Nietzsche envisaged this, a master morality society. And the U.S. government had decided that you could only fight a master morality using its own terms, on its own terms, using its own tactics. And so what happens is the U.S. had this bifurcated mentality where you would use mass morality tactics secretly, keep all this secret from the public, but in terms of internal domestic politics, in terms of what's going on in the U.S., we would remain committed to Enlightenment principles of justice and fairness and so on. And of all the terrible things that Richard Nixon did, the most terrible was he overturned this doctrine, this bifurcation between what was morally permissible in abroad and what is morally permissible in domestic affairs. And Nixon initiated this idea that that the Cold War is as much a function of what's happening within America as outside America. And there's a very famous quote that I've got where he says to Haldeman, "We are up against an enemy, a conspiracy, and we are going to use any means. Is that clear?" And what he's saying here is that the enemy are the Democrats. The Democrats are seeking to enslave us, enslave the Nixon administration. That's the conspiracy. And so we, as master morality figures, will use any means in our possession, including, breaking into Watergate, whatever, stealing the Pentagon Papers, in order to prevent the enemy, who have no scruples, from defeating us. So this shift, this blurring of the lines between domestic and international, was going to have very quickly a huge impact on American politics. And through that, I think, on the rest of the world. And basically, Nixon was, without shame, he was a shameless figure and would use shameless actions to destroy his opposition, even though he won the most resounding victory in 1972. But it wasn't enough. He wanted to obliterate what he saw as the enemy. And the reason for that was because of the checks and balances in the U.S. The Democrats had controlled Congress, the House of Representatives, forever. And this Democratic majority, being led by Tip O'Neill, was frustrating whatever it was that Nixon wanted to do. They could veto his actions. So when he declares that they're the enemy to Haldeman, what he means is, what he's really thinking of was what's called the Permanent Democratic Congress. They were in power for 33 years. They controlled Congress. This inspired the young Newt Gingrich to capitalize on shamelessness, to finally break the grip that the Democrats had on Congress. So there's a great book written about this by Steve Kornacki called The Red and the Blue, published just a couple of years ago. Adam will put this in the notes. And basically it tells the story of how Gingrich himself was, again, one of these characters with total shamelessness. And he would use whatever tactics he could to discredit the opposition, to break the Democrats' control of the House of Representatives. And so he starts off and, he launches this attack on various Democratic leaders, which was without foundation, utterly shameless. And it sends Tip O'Neill into a rage. And he falls into the trap that Gingrich had set for him, loses his temper, loses his cool. The result is that Gingrich is really responsible for Tip O'Neill's retiring. And so he's taken over by Jim Wright, who was still one of the gentlemen, the old mentality of consensus politics. And so Gingrich uses the same tactics, shamelessness tactics, to bring down Wright. Wright had published a collected book of essays, and Gingrich was able to, had discovered that Wright's cronies had bought up the book, and Wright received, just this ridiculous 55% royalties on the book. And it was a way of skirting financial regulations. And so the pressure mounted. It was a shaming campaign. So this shameless figure used shaming to bring down Wright. And Wright eventually he fought the fight and was shamed in the court of public opinion and had to quit. And so Gingrich did this over and over, using shamelessness as a political tool, and eventually he forces out the minority leader, the Republican minority leader, and it really marks the end. This is a guy called Bob Mischel, who was known as Mr. Nice Guy, and it marked the end of, let's call it, the idea of consensus politics that lies at the very heart of the Enlightenment. The idea that we would debate in a manner that was designed to give everyone an opportunity to argue their case, and then decide to abide by the consensus decision, the will of the majority. And so what Gingrich was doing was overturning these Enlightenment rules that go all the way back to John Milton, certainly exemplified by Isaiah Berlin. And what mattered was that the Republicans broke the permanent Democratic Congress, that the Republicans could finally take power, be the majority in Congress. And I just want to make clear that this is very well explained in Kornacki's book. This isn't just the Republicans. Exactly the same thing was going on during the Clinton years. I won't go into that. It starts very early on in Clinton's career. The fights that were waged over his affairs, or I've forgotten her name now. Was it Jennifer Flowers? It starts with that, or with the Whitewater financing scheme. The point is that politics at the congressional level and the Senate, so politics in Congress, had come to be a fight over power and not over ideas. Ideas, that's a quaint Enlightenment concept. Power is what mattered. Power becomes a goal in its own right. And what I find fascinating about this is how a shameless figure used shaming over and over to achieve his ends. And that's exactly what we saw with Trump. So Trump, if ever there was a shameless character, you think about the things that happened during his campaign, the Action Hollywood tape, or the way that he would belittle with these terrible nicknames that he gave to his opponents, or the one that disturbed me the most was that second presidential debate with Clinton, where he is looming behind her, and here the idea was, a lesson they had learned from the Nixon-Kennedy debates. It was simply to project an image to the public of Trump being far more powerful than, large, big, menacing than Hillary Clinton. So utterly shameless behavior, but it made its point. It had its impact. What's going on here? You can look at this. Well, this is just a shift in the tone of politics, that politics now becomes, this nasty, vicious fight. But in fact, what's really going on is there's a change in morality. And it's coming from the top, and it is exemplified by this new breed of utterly shameless figures. And I'm sure you won't have any trouble thinking up some of the members of Congress that exemplify exactly what I'm talking about. So what's really going on here is there's a shift in morality, a shift from what Nietzsche would call slave morality, which is what was dominant in the US after the war, to a master morality where no holds barred. And I kind of think when I read, for example, the various things that Steve Bannon has said, you really get the sense that this is an intentional counter-revolution, that what they're after here isn't simply power for the sake of having power. What they're really after is overturning the Enlightenment, overturning those values that are enshrined in the Enlightenment that we take for granted. So, the values of universal suffrage, of universal education, of no one's above the law, and the rule of justice. So what's really going on here is a counter-revolution that is being led by figures that are trying to overturn the moral norms that have governed our society, let's say since the end of the 18th century, at least as an ideology, as a moral framework. And as I thought about this, it struck me that as a self-regger, this casts a fascinating light on the argument that Walter Bradford Kennan made in The Wisdom of the Body. At the end of The Wisdom of the Body, Kennan uses, so he's introduced homeostasis and he explains what it is, and he then argues that homeostasis should be the model for society, that a healthy society is one that is, quote, self-regulating. Now, what he is thinking of, and this became very clear in the last 2 decades of his life as he returns to this argument over and over, is Kennan was an Enlightenment thinker. Kennan is trying to use his model of the body, his homeostasis, as a way of preserving democracy. And he's writing this at a time where the West has just gone through this enormous shock of the Great Depression. And he's looking at the rise of fascism in Germany and in Italy in the 1930s, Italy a little earlier. And what he's arguing is that that a healthy society is one in which, quote, we foster the stability of the society, both physical and mental, of the members of the social organism, and provide the primary conditions for the discipline and enjoyment of individual aptitudes and freedoms. So what he's saying is that, he's saying a couple things. One, that for democracy to survive, it has to stay in homeostasis. The society has to stay in homeostasis. And two, that there's always going to be extreme shocks to the system, such as the Depression. But he's arguing a homeostatic society is much better able to adapt to these shocks to the system than a fixed, a top-down, a command society. So he's not saying that only a democracy can be stable. Command societies obviously can be very stable. And, back in the 30s or in the 1940s, it looked like the Soviet Union, which was a command society, a master morality, was going to be, permanent, that nothing could shake it. But Cannon, with remarkable foresight, was saying that no, the democratic society is much better able to adapt to great shocks than the master morality society, than the command society. And the reason is that you will always have in the democracy, in the homeostatic society, forces will emerge such as impassioned leaders, charismatic groups, scientists, and that's a big one for Cannon. Scientists that are intent on finding truth rather than on simply reinforcing whatever the command center dictates. These are natural feed-forward mechanisms, they'll call them. These are natural aspects of the homeostatic democracy, which enable it not just to survive, and this is the key, not just to survive the shock, but to grow from the shock, to grow emotionally, to grow psychologically. And so what his argument is that a democracy can grow from something like COVID, whereas the command society cannot. And so you can have the command society, the mass morality. What it will try to do is where the democracy uses shame to maintain group cohesion around what's right and wrong. The command society, the master morality, uses terror and surveillance. And the obvious example of this would be George Orwell's 1984. Orwell, living on his island at the end of his life, saw the same thing, made the same warning. And, with historical hindsight, we can, say that Cannon was remarkably astute. The Soviet Union responded to its internal stresses by, for example, building the wall in Berlin. The point of the Berlin Wall wasn't to keep Westerners out. It was to keep East Germans in. They were fleeing in droves to the West. And so the government, East German government and Russia were alarmed. They were losing the best and the brightest that were fleeing from communist rules, and that's why they built the wall. Or you could respond to the Hungarian uprising in '56 by sending in your tanks, or the same response to the Prague Spring in '68, send in the tanks. So what Cannon was saying is that a totalitarian society can't respond flexibly, can't grow from these internal stresses. Instead, they are stuck in their whatever their mindset is. So, for example, the Brezhnev doctrine, which was wherever there are faint stirrings of unrest in a Soviet country, send in the tanks, send in the military, suppress it. And it couldn't survive the stresses, the new stresses that were emerging. So, it couldn't handle, for example, solidarity, or it couldn't handle Pope John Paul II, or it couldn't handle the collapse of the price of oil, which had been what was sustaining them in the 70s. And so it forced the Soviet Union finally. They kept on sticking under the Brezhnev doctrine. They kept on sticking to their leaders were, the gerontocracy that were schooled in this old way of thinking. They couldn't change. And so they realized that they had to do something different if they were going to survive as a system. So they appoint Mikhail Gorbachev, the first young leader. And Gorbachev's job was to try to prevent the whole thing from falling apart, which he tried to do through perestroika and then through glasnost. But all to no avail. The system was crumbling. It couldn't deal with the new internal stresses, particularly the stress of citizens now that were finally fed up, and eventually it led, to the appointment of Boris Yeltsin as president, and that was the end of the Soviet Union. The shift, the incredibly rapid shift in '89 to a capitalist society, and of course, Cannon's point isn't just about. He's not just talking about social stability. He is talking about freedom. And he's making the point that he had learned from Claude Bernard. And I've talked about this in one of my webinars, but it's that famous line where Bernard says, and this goes back to 65, he says, la fixité du milieu intérieur est la condition de la vie libre, indépendante. What he's saying is homeostasis is the basis of freedom. And so Cannon's argument at the end of his life was homeostasis. The homeostasis of a democracy is the foundation of individual freedom, the freedom to live and do whatever and think whatever you want, provided you don't harm another. It's the freedom to change leaders. It's the freedom to help shape policy. You lose all those in a master morality. And that's why we have so much alarm in Western societies at the prospect of this incredible moral swing that the shameless leaders are trying to institute, this change in ethics. So why would anyone agree to this? Why would anyone agree to give up all those freedoms that Cannon held so dear? And so dynamic systems theory holds the key here, and that is that when you are looking at this profound shift from one morality to another morality, so in Nietzsche's terms, from a slave morality to a master morality, well, in our terms, from a democratic, from an enlightened morality to a fascistic-like morality, how can you institute that at the societal level? And the answer is by creating dysregulation. So in dynamic systems theory terms, the enlightened morality is an attractor, solidly entrenched. And so you have to create as much chaos as you possibly can in order to make this huge moral shift. And that's been the secret of all the communist revolutions. So beginning with Lenin, it was not at all what Marx had predicted, that the proletariat would they would rise up because of their anger. Instead, it was top down. It was led by a revolutionary vanguard. A revolutionary vanguard that is utterly shameless, that will do anything and everything they can to bring about the revolution. So I mentioned, in the last podcast, there's this idea that anyone who behaves shamelessly has repressed feelings of shame. I'm really not sure. I'm really not sure when I look at today's crop of shameless leaders that they do have repressed feelings of shame. I'm not sure that hasn't been killed. I'm not sure that what we're seeing is simply narcissism. I'm wondering if, the parts of the social brain that might feel empathy, that might feel compassion have been killed, have been shut down. I don't know. There is evidence. Adrian Rain has a very interesting book called The Anatomy of Violence to suggest that what we're looking at here is how you can, in fact, shut down these parts of the brain, of the human brain. So the shameless behavior doesn't cause any feeling of guilt, doesn't cause, instead, you are focused on not just amassing power, but undoing all those Enlightenment norms. The idea that everyone deserves a vote, the idea that everyone is entitled to education. And so if I stick to that dynamic systems model, so you get huge societal dysregulation, which makes it possible for the shameless leader to reverse your moral compass. And that's what this is. And if we're talking about a society in this red brain state, then we are not talking about anyone agreeing to go along. These are red brain behaviors. These are not choice. These are not belief. This is getting swept up. And the obvious emotions that sweep up individuals are fear and anger. And in this case, particularly, anger. And I wanted to close with just a couple of minutes on that point. I was struck when Nikki Haley gave the response for the Republicans to Obama's State of the Union speech in 2016. She said, quote, "During anxious times, like the present, it could be tempting to follow the siren call of the angriest voices. We must resist that temptation." Now, this was a very subtle attack on Trump, on Trump's campaigning. And so they interviewed Trump afterwards on CNN and asked him what he thought about her speech. And he said, quote, "Well, I think she's right. I am angry. I'm angry. And a lot of other people are angry too at how incompetently our country's being run. As far as I'm concerned, anger is okay. Anger and energy is what this country needs." And that's exactly what we saw. So we watched these rallies where what the Trump team was doing was they had, through their own policy analysis, they had a much better fix on the state of anger in American society than Nikki Haley's team did. And they were tapping into that anger and exploiting that anger and intensifying that anger. It was astonishing thing to see this anger unleashed. And we saw the same thing in Brexit, right? So playing on anger, which is a red brain, unfocused behavior. Now, why were Americans, why are Brits so angry? And there's lots of reasons, lots of analysis. I don't want to go into that. One of the big ones, from a self-reg perspective, is prominent, is the contagion effect. Anger is a very contagious emotion. It fires off limbic systems beneath the threshold of awareness. And what does concern me is how this is all picking up speed now. The anger is spreading. The shamelessness is spreading. So we are witnessing, I'm finding it very difficult now to read the morning papers. I'm reading about behaviors that just a short while ago would have been a scandal. So the very possibility that the US government might have politicized their response to COVID, I would have thought there would be this massive outrage, but there was nothing. We've become habituated now to shamelessness. And for me, that's what I'm most worried about. So yes, I am, like many, worried about the threat to democracy. But on a deeper level, I'm worried about the threat to the morality, to the ethos, the Enlightenment norms, the Enlightenment value perception of right and wrong that underpins, that sustains, that is the source of the cohesion on which democracy rests. That's what I think is being attacked. And it's being attacked by working on red brains. The red brain doesn't feel emotions of A red brain that's been inflamed, that's been hyper-aroused, is easily led into angry reactions, and then the blue brain will rationalize. The blue brain will justify why you're taking away votes, why you are trying to institute a permanent Republican Congress. We're in a sort of flux right now. The Enlightenment insisted on moral absolutes, justice, truth, liberty, freedom. The mass morality insists on what's called epistemological relativism. Truth is, this is, 1984 again. Truth is what I say it is. Truth is simply a weapon to consolidate power. And I love this quote, and you'll all remember it, when Kellyanne Conway was on Meet the Press. And Chuck Todd was pressing her about the lie that Sean Spicer kept telling about the size of the inauguration crowds. And Conway responded, quote, "You're saying it's a falsehood." And they're giving, Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts. But that's how the mass morality sees it. And the key here is, of course, not only could she say that with a straight face, she was utterly shameless saying it. She didn't feel any sense of shame in saying this. So what are the tools that have been used? How is it possible to upend our very sense of what's right and wrong, what's true and false? That's going to be my topic for the last podcast in this 6-part series. Okay? So this podcast was brought to you today by Self-Reg Global as part of its mission to bring self-reg knowledge to audiences around the world. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, follow Self-Reg Global on social media, and if you missed anything, you can check out the show notes at Self-Reg Global's website, selfregglobal.com. Thank you for joining me today for this episode of the Shanker Chronicles, and join me again for my next and last episode in this 6-part series on self-reg and the great challenges of our times. Thanks, everyone.